The jet lag was a heavy, physical weight pressing behind my eyes as I pulled my suitcase up the driveway at 3 in the morning. I had spent the last 14 days in 3 different time zones, surviving on hotel coffee and 4-hour stretches of sleep while I negotiated the contracts that were currently keeping my firm from going under. My suit was wrinkled, my back ached, and my brain felt like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper. But the one thing keeping me upright was the thought of opening my front door and hearing the frantic, happy thud of Cooper's tail against the hardwood floor. Cooper was a golden retriever mix I had rescued from a high-kill shelter 3 years ago, and in a life filled with spreadsheets and high-stakes litigation, he was the only living creature that didn't want anything from me other than a belly rub and a walk. Usually, he'd be barking before I even got the key in the lock, sensing my presence from the street. But tonight, the house was a tomb. I twisted the handle and stepped into the entryway, expecting a golden blur to tackle me. Nothing happened. The air felt stale, smelling of old grease and cheap cologne. I walked into the living room, and there was my brother, Marcus, sprawled across my Italian leather sofa. He had my laptop open on his knees and was digging into a pile of expensive Thai takeout that I knew for a fact he hadn't paid for with his own money. He didn't even look up when I walked in. He just kept chewing, his eyes glued to a sports betting site. I stood there for a long beat, waiting for the barking to start from the backyard or the laundry room. I asked him where Cooper was. Marcus took a slow sip of a soda, one from the premium pack I keep in the back of the fridge, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at me with a bored, almost annoyed expression, as if my presence was an interruption to his very busy schedule of being a professional leech. He told me he sold the dog. He said it so casually, with such a complete lack of empathy, that for a second, I thought I had misheard him due to the exhaustion. I asked him what he meant. He leaned back, crossing his feet on my mahogany coffee table, and explained that the shedding had gotten out of control while I was away. He claimed it was a breathing hazard and that he was doing me a favor by clearing out the mess. Then came the real reason. He said a guy he met at a bar was looking for a purebred-looking retriever for his kids and offered him cash on the spot. Marcus needed the money for what he called a sure-thing investment, some cryptobot strategy his friend had told him about that was guaranteed to triple his stake in a week. He talked about the dog like it was a piece of furniture he had decided to flip for a profit, rather than a living soul that had been my only companion through my father's funeral and my own health scares. I felt the blood drain from my face, replaced by a cold, vibrating numbness. I had paid for Marcus's car insurance, his health bills, and his rent for 2 years because he was family, and family was supposed to mean something. I had given him a key to my home so he wouldn't have to stay in a shelter after his last failure. And while I was across the ocean earning the money that kept him fed, he had looked at my best friend and seen nothing but a way to fund a gambling habit. He didn't see the irony in selling my property to fund an investment while living off my charity. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $50 bill, and tossed it toward me. It fluttered through the air and landed near my suitcase. He told me that was my cut of the sale since he did all the work of finding a buyer. He went back to his game, shouting at the screen as a player missed a shot. He handed me a $50 bill, my cut of the sale, and went back to his game. He had no idea he just signed his own financial death warrant. I stared at that crumpled $50 bill on the floor, and suddenly, the last 5 years of my life began to play back in a nauseating loop. I thought about the time Marcus called me at 3 in the morning, sobbing because he had bottomed out again. I didn't just pick him up, I paid $40,000 for a private rehab facility that he treated like a luxury vacation, only to walk out 3 weeks early because he didn't like the food. I thought about my mother's house, the one she nearly lost after my father died. I was the one who cleared the arrears and took over the mortgage payments, ensuring she never had to pack a single box. Then there was my sister, Sarah. When she wanted a fairy tale wedding she couldn't afford, I was the silent partner who covered the open bar, the venue, and the dress, all while she complained that I was too busy with work to help her pick out the flower arrangements. To them, I wasn't a brother or a son. I was a high-yield savings account that never asked for interest. I was a success machine designed to output wire transfers and bailouts on demand. They saw my 80-hour workweeks not as a sacrifice, but as my natural duty to the family. And then there was Cooper. I had found him during the darkest winter of my life, just months after Dad passed away and while I was pulling a failing startup through its first major crisis. He was shivering in a corner of a shelter, labeled as unadoptable because of his anxiety. We saved each other. While my family spent our Sunday dinners asking when I was going to get a bigger bonus or if I could invest in their latest harebrained schemes, Cooper was the only one who just wanted to sit by my feet. He didn't care about my job title or my net worth. To my family, however, he was a nuisance. My mother would constantly moan about the golden hair on her expensive coats I had bought her. Sarah would roll her eyes if he tried to lick her hand, calling him a dirty animal that didn't belong in a nice house. They hated the space he took up in my life because every minute I spent walking him or every dollar I spent on his premium kibble was a resource that wasn't being directed toward their bottomless needs. They viewed his presence as a direct competitor for my attention. Standing there in the silence of my own living room, watching Marcus celebrate a digital score on my television, the fog finally lifted. I saw the hierarchy they had built in their minds. At the top were their whims and their comfort, and at the bottom was me, the provider who was supposed to have no needs of his own. Cooper was the only part of my life that was purely mine, a small island of unconditional affection that they couldn't manipulate or guilt-trip. By selling him, Marcus wasn't just looking for gambling money, he was pruning my life of anything that didn't serve the family collective. He was asserting that even my heart was community property. I realized then, they didn't just hate the dog. They hated that I loved something more than I loved serving them. I didn't scream at Marcus. I didn't even pick up the $50 bill. To scream would be to show him that I was still emotionally invested in his approval or his redemption, and that version of me had died the moment he put a price tag on Cooper. Instead, I walked past him, my footsteps heavy but intentional, and went into my home office. I heard him mutter something about me being dramatic, followed by the familiar crunch of a prawn cracker. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. The click of the lock felt like the first note of a funeral march. I sat down at my desk, the glow of the triple monitors reflecting in my glasses, and I didn't open a browser to search for dog buyers, not yet. First, I needed to see the architecture of my own exploitation. I opened a fresh Excel spreadsheet. I titled the file Family Distribution, but in my head, I called it the autopsy. I started with the big numbers, the ones that were burned into my memory like scars. I pulled up my banking archives from 10 years ago and worked forward, month by grueling month. There was the $22,000 for Marcus's first failed landscaping business, a venture that lasted exactly 3 weeks before he sold the equipment for operating costs. There was the $68,000 I had funneled into my mother's home equity line of credit because she had been misled by a predatory lender, or so she said at the time. I typed in the $4,000 for Sarah's emergency dental work that turned out to be high-end veneers she just had to have for her social media photos. Line by line, the spreadsheet began to grow, a digital tombstone for my generosity. I added the smaller things too, the ones that sting more in retrospect. Every utility bill I'd paid for Marcus's various apartments. Every bridge loan for groceries that was never repaid. Every plane ticket I bought for them to fly out and visit me. Only for them to spend the whole trip complaining about the weather or the food. I went through my credit card statements and tagged every charge that wasn't mine. The numbers crawled up the side of the screen like a fever. 200,000. 350,000. By the time I hit the 10-year mark, the cell at the bottom of the sheet performed a final, cold calculation, $412,000. That was the price of my loyalty. That was the cost of being the good son and the reliable brother. It was nearly $500,000 of my life, my hours, and my stress, handed over to people who couldn't be bothered to watch a dog for 14 days without selling him for spare change. I looked at that number, $412,000, and felt a strange, detached sense of relief. It was too high a price for a human being to pay for the privilege of being disrespected. But as I scrolled through my scanned documents folder to find the deed to the property Marcus was currently sitting in, I found something even better. 3 years ago, when I bought the townhouse Marcus lived in before moving in with me, I had insisted on a formal lease agreement. At the time, I told him it was just a formality for the insurance company, a way to keep things businesslike so the IRS wouldn't flag the gift. My mother and Marcus had laughed, calling me a typical corporate suit, but they had signed the papers anyway because they wanted the keys. They had signed a standard, ironclad residential lease that included clauses for property damage, unauthorized subletting, and, most importantly, a right to immediate termination for illegal activity on the premises. They had treated those signatures like a joke, a minor hurdle on the way to a free ride. I leaned back in my chair, the blue light of the screen illuminating the cold smile spreading across my face. I wasn't looking for a refund. I was looking for leverage. And boy, did I find the lease agreement they all forgot they signed. The next morning, I didn't confront Marcus at the breakfast table. I didn't ask him for the buyer's name or phone number, because I knew Marcus would only lie to protect his investment or try to extort more money out of me for the information. Instead, I waited until he left the house in my spare car to meet his bookie, and then I made a single phone call to a man named Elias. Elias was a retired skip tracer I'd used years ago for a corporate fraud case. He was clinical, expensive, and didn't ask questions about why a grown man was paying a premium rate to find a golden retriever mix. I gave him the microchip ID number and the last known location of my brother's phone on the day I was away. I also gave him Marcus's bank login, which I still managed as his accountant, to see where the cash deposit had originated. By noon, Elias called me back. The news made my stomach turn. Marcus hadn't sold Cooper to a nice family with a backyard and kids. He had sold him to a notorious backyard breeder on the edge of the county, a man who operated out of a rusted trailer and used a string of shell companies to avoid animal cruelty charges. The buyer had paid $500, seeing Cooper as nothing more than a stud or a placeholder in a cage. I didn't call the police yet. If I involved the authorities immediately, the dog might be seized as evidence and stuck in a county kennel for months while the legal gears ground away. I couldn't let Cooper spend another hour in a cage. I drove out to the address Elias provided, a desolate patch of dirt surrounded by chain-link fencing and the sound of barking dogs that broke my heart when the breeder came to the gate. He looked like the kind of man who would sell his own mother for a carton of cigarettes. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him the dog was stolen. I simply told him I was a collector of specific breeds and I had heard he had a fresh acquisition. When he brought Cooper out, the dog was trembling. His beautiful golden coat was matted with filth, and his eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen in him before. He didn't even bark when he saw me, he just slumped to the ground and let out a low, mourning whimper. The breeder told me the price was $5,000, firm. He knew I was desperate, and he was testing how far my wallet would open. He probably thought he was winning, thinking he'd turned a 10 times profit in 24 hours on a stupid city guy. I reached into my bag and counted out $100 bills. I handed them over without blinking. To me, that money was nothing compared to the weight of Cooper's head resting against my knee as soon as the gate opened. I loaded him into the back of my SUV, wrapped him in a clean wool blanket, and drove him straight to an emergency vet 2 towns over. I paid for a full suite of tests, a deep grooming, and a private boarding suite where he could stay under a hidden name for the next week. I needed him somewhere safe, somewhere Marcus and my mother would never think to look, while I prepared the battlefield. As I watched the vet technician lead him back, Cooper looking over his shoulder one last time to make sure I was still there, the last shred of my hesitation vanished. The financial audit was done. The dog was recovered. The only thing left to do was to introduce my family to the reality of the world they had spent 10 years trying to avoid. I had spent $5,000 to undo my brother's greed, but I considered it a down payment on the destruction that was coming for him. Buster was safe. Now, it was time to make sure my brother was anything but. I spent the drive back from the vet in a state of icy, focused clarity. The family ecosystem, as I had come to call it, was a complex web of autopays, supplementary credit cards, and direct transfers that I had built over a decade to keep my relatives comfortable. It was a life support system for people who refused to breathe on their own. I pulled over into a quiet parking lot, opened my laptop, and began the systematic process of unplugging the tubes. I started with the most immediate tool of Marcus's freedom, the 2024 sedan he drove. The car was registered in my name, insured under my policy, and paid for entirely by my labor. I logged into the GPS tracking portal and saw he was currently idling at a drive-thru. I didn't just disable the remote start, I called the non-emergency police line. I informed them that my vehicle had been taken without permission by an individual who was no longer authorized to use it and that I wished to report it as an unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. I gave them his exact coordinates. Next, I turned my attention to my mother. She was currently at a high-end bistro with her friends, likely bragging about my latest promotion while sipping a vintage Chardonnay on my dime. I opened my banking app and navigated to the Manage Cards section. I found the Platinum supplementary card I'd given her for emergencies only, which she interpreted as 3-course lunches and designer scarves, and I clicked Report Lost or Stolen. It was a clean, digital kill. I knew exactly what would happen in 20 minutes when the waiter brought the leather checkbook to the table. She would feel that sharp, cold prick of social embarrassment as the chip reader flash declined, and for the first time in years, she would have to look at her friends and admit she couldn't cover her own indulgence. Finally, I went for the most expensive line item, my sister Sarah's graduate school tuition. The payment for the upcoming semester had been scheduled for processing that morning. It was a staggering $12,000 for a degree she was mostly using as a social club. I called the registrar's office directly. I told them there had been a massive clerical error and that the funds being used were part of a disputed trust. I reversed the wire transfer. I knew that within the hour, she would receive an automated email informing her that her enrollment was pending immediate payment or she would be dropped from her clinical rotations. It was a series of cold, administrative strikes. For years, I had been told that I was lucky to be able to provide for them, as if my bank account was a communal well and I was merely the bucket. They had forgotten that a well can be capped. They had forgotten that the only reason they lived in a world of air-conditioned comfort and premium subscriptions was because I chose to allow it. By selling Cooper, they had broken the unspoken contract that kept the money flowing. They thought they could take my heart and keep my wallet. I sat in my car, watching the digital confirmations scroll by on my screen, feeling a strange lack of guilt. I had been their safety net for so long that they had mistaken me for the floor. Now, I was going to let them see exactly how far they could fall without me there to catch them. The silence of the car was interrupted by the first vibration of my phone. Then another. Then a frantic, rhythmic buzzing that moved the device across the dashboard. My mother's name flashed on the screen, followed by a string of high-priority alerts from Sarah. The "I hate you" text started within the hour. But the best one was from my brother, who was currently being pulled over. While the phone on my dashboard continued to scream with notifications, I ignored the noise and went deeper into the digital shadows Marcus had left behind. For years, I had purposefully looked the other way regarding his side hustles, assuming they were just harmless, failed attempts at being a businessman. But the moment Cooper was taken, my willingness to be blind evaporated. I needed to know exactly what kind of sure-thing investment was worth my dog's life. I accessed the shared cloud drive on our home network, a space Marcus used because he was too cheap to pay for his own storage. He had left a folder titled Business Assets unprotected. Within minutes of scrolling through encrypted messaging logs and poorly formatted spreadsheets, the picture became sickeningly clear. Marcus wasn't just gambling on sports, he was acting as a mid-level runner for an unlicensed, offshore betting ring that targeted local college students. He was collecting cash, taking a percentage, and funneling the rest through a dummy LLC he'd set up using our mother's maiden name. It was a classic, amateur-hour money laundering operation that was as illegal as it was clumsy. He had been using my high-speed internet, my home office, and my clean reputation as a shield for a criminal enterprise. The realization made my skin crawl. He had brought this filth into my home while I was out representing Fortune 500 companies. I didn't hesitate. I opened the IRS whistleblower portal and began the process of filing a Form 211. I attached the spreadsheets, the chat logs, and the bank transaction records I had uncovered during my initial audit. I didn't just stop with the federal government, I sent a detailed tip to the state's Bureau of Occupational Licenses regarding his consulting firm. I knew that once the IRS saw the discrepancy between his reported income of zero and the thousands of dollars flowing through his offshore accounts, they wouldn't just send a letter. They would dismantle his life with a surgical precision that only a government agency can achieve. But as I dug further into his recent activity, looking for any other links to the dog breeder, I found a document that made the air leave my lungs. It was a PDF of a personal loan application for $50,000 from a private equity firm known for high interest rates and aggressive collection tactics. My name was at the top. My social security number was filled in with perfect accuracy. And there, at the bottom of the final page, was a signature that looked remarkably like mine, but with a slight, telltale tremor in the cursive S that I only ever saw in Marcus's handwriting when he was nervous. He hadn't just sold my dog, he had stolen my identity to secure a high-interest loan to cover his mounting gambling debts. He had bet my credit score and my financial future on the same sure thing that had cost me Cooper. This wasn't just a sibling being a deadbeat anymore. This was a direct, predatory attack on the foundation of everything I had built. He had sat at my dinner table, eaten the food I bought, and smiled at me while he was committing a crime that could result in 10 years of federal prison time, and looked at the digital signature on the screen, feeling a cold, crystalline rage that I didn't know I was capable of. For years, I had been the one to fix his messes, to smooth over his mistakes, and to tell myself that he was just a late bloomer who needed a little more help, had paid for his mistakes with my time, my money, and my peace of mind. But forgery was the point of no return. It was the moment the brother died and the criminal emerged. I downloaded the loan documents and sent them straight to my personal attorney with a short, 2-sentence cover note. I didn't ask for advice on how to handle it internally. I didn't ask for a family meeting to discuss restitution. I told him to prepare a criminal complaint and to notify the lender's fraud department immediately. I knew exactly what the consequences would be. I knew that the lender would move to freeze any assets associated with the loan, and that the police would soon be upgrading their interest in Marcus from unauthorized use of a vehicle to identity theft and felony forgery. I thought about my mother's inevitable pleas for mercy, her claims that he's just a boy who made a mistake, and the way she would try to use my own success as a weapon against me, telling me that I could afford to let this go. But that version of me, the one who cared about her manipulative tears, was gone. He had vanished the moment I saw that trembling signature on a document designed to ruin me. I closed the laptop, the screen's light fading to black, and leaned back in the driver's seat. I could almost hear the gears of the legal system beginning to grind, a slow, massive machine that would eventually crush Marcus under its weight. I was no longer the provider. I was the witness for the prosecution. Forgery isn't just a family betrayal, it's a felony. And I wasn't in a forgiving mood. The banging on my front door started at 6 o'clock that evening, a frantic, rhythmic thudding that shook the heavy oak frame. I didn't get up from my armchair. I simply reached over, picked up my phone, and opened the app for my security cameras. On the screen, I saw the family ecosystem in its final, frantic death throes. My mother was there, her face blotchy and red, screaming at the doorbell camera about her declined credit card and the humiliation she suffered at the bistro. My sister Sarah was right behind her, waving her phone like a weapon, likely tallying the minutes until her tuition deadline expired. And then there was Marcus. He looked disheveled, his eyes darting around the street, likely because he was driving a rental car he couldn't afford after the police had impounded my sedan, didn't say a word. I sat in the dim light of the living room, Cooper's empty bed a silent witness beside me, and I hit the record button on my phone, when they realized I wasn't going to open the door, Marcus transitioned from pleading to pure, unadulterated rage. He began to kick the lower panels of the door, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. He wasn't even pretending to be the victim anymore. The mask of the misunderstood brother had slipped, revealing a predatory, entitled monster who felt his primary source of income was being unjustly withheld, stood up, walked calmly to the entryway, and stood on the other side of the glass. I didn't unlock the bolt. I just held my phone up, filming Marcus as he spat on the windows and screamed obscenities that would have made a sailor blush, and why mother started wailing, telling the neighborhood that I was killing her, that my greed was destroying the family, and that I was a heartless monster for withholding her medicine, by which she meant her high-end lifestyle. Sarah was recording me from her side, screaming that she would ruin my reputation and tell my firm that I was an abuser. It was a symphony of projected guilt. Marcus, seeing my face through the glass, went into a frenzy. He picked up a heavy decorative planter from the porch and slammed it against the door, the wood splintering but holding. He screamed that he knew I had the money, that it was his birthright as much as mine, and that I had no right to shut him out after everything he'd done for me. He actually said those words, everything he had done for me. In his twisted reality, his mere existence was a service for which I owed him a lifetime of labor. He wasn't thinking about the dog he sold. He wasn't thinking about the $50,000 he'd forged my name for. He was only thinking about the hole in his pocket where my money used to be. I remained a statue, my silence acting as a mirror that reflected their ugliness back at them. The more I didn't react, the more violent he became, until he was literally throwing his shoulder against the door, his face contorted into something subhuman. He was shouting about the sure thing he'd lost and how I was going to pay him back for every cent of his lost profit. He was so loud, so convinced of his own righteousness, that he didn't hear the sirens in the distance. He didn't see the neighbors coming out onto their porches with their own phones out. He just kept slamming himself against my life, trying to break his way back into a vault that had been permanently sealed. He screamed that I owed him, that I was nothing without the family, and that he would burn the house down before he let me keep a single dollar of my hoarded wealth. He was mid-swing with a heavy porch chair, his veins bulging in his neck, when I finally tapped the screen on my second phone, which was sitting on the hallway table. He screamed that I owed him. My lawyer, who was silently listening on the speakerphone, finally spoke up. The voice that cut through the chaos wasn't mine, it was the measured, predatory baritone of my attorney, David, echoing through the hallway speaker. The screaming on the porch died instantly, replaced by a confused, jagged silence. David didn't lead with pleasantries. He spoke directly to the doorbell camera, his voice amplified so every neighbor on the block could hear the legal reality of the situation. He began by addressing Marcus, citing the exact penal codes for the unauthorized use of a motor vehicle and the felony identity theft charges that had been filed only 2 hours prior. David explained, with a chilling lack of emotion, that since Cooper was a high-value, professionally trained animal with documented service certifications, his sale didn't constitute a pet dispute. It was a case of grand theft of property. Marcus's face went from an angry red to a sickly, translucent white. My mother started to interject, her voice trembling as she tried to play the family matter card, but David cut her off with a verbal scalpel. He informed her that the mortgage payments, the bridge loans, and the tuition payments were all backed by the promissory notes I had quietly made them sign over the years under the guise of estate planning. By defaulting on their behavior clauses and attempting to breach my primary residence, they had triggered an immediate acceleration of the debt. The $412,000 I had calculated in my office was no longer a theoretical loss, it was a formal civil judgment in the making. Just as Marcus began to stammer a response, 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, their blue and red lights painting my splintered front door in strobe flashes. I finally turned the deadbolt and stepped out, the cool night air hitting my face. I didn't look at Marcus. I looked at the officers and handed them a folder containing the temporary restraining order and the trespass notices for every individual on the porch. The officers didn't waste time. They saw the smashed planter, the splintered wood of the door, and the hysterical state of my family. One officer put his hand on his belt and told Marcus to turn around. My mother began to wail, a sound of pure theatrical grief, claiming that I was throwing them into the street like garbage. Sarah tried to argue that the tuition reversal was a breach of contract, but the officer simply told her to take it up with a judge. They were being removed from the only source of warmth they had ever known, and the reality was finally sinking in. The ATM was broken, and the bank was calling in the security guards. I stood on the threshold, a ghost in my own home, watching as the people who had spent a decade draining my soul were marched toward the sidewalk. Marcus looked back at me, his eyes full of a pathetic, desperate hatred, but I wasn't looking at him anymore. I whistled once, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the noise of the police radios. From the side of the house, where my trusted neighbor had just brought him back from the vet's private boarding, Cooper trotted into view. He looked magnificent, clean, healthy, and entirely indifferent to the people who had tried to discard him. As they were being escorted out, I made sure they saw Buster sitting on the porch, eating a steak that cost more than my brother's shoes. 6 months have passed since the night the blue and red lights illuminated the wreckage of my front porch, and the silence in my new home is the most expensive thing I own. The collapse of the family empire was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing slide into the dirt, exactly as I had choreographed. Marcus didn't get a slap on the wrist. When the private equity firm realized their $50,000 loan was based on a forged signature, they didn't just sue, they went to the district attorney with a mountain of evidence. Combined with the IRS investigation into his offshore betting ring, Marcus found himself facing a reality that no amount of charm or sure-thing investments could fix. He is currently serving the first year of a 3-year sentence in a state facility, and according to the few updates I receive from my lawyer, he is finding that the respect he demanded from me carries very little weight behind a steel door. My mother and Sarah didn't fare much better. Once the promissory notes were called in and the mortgage payments stopped, the bank moved with the cold efficiency of a guillotine. The family home, the one I had bled for to keep afloat, was sold at auction. I didn't buy it back. I let a developer snap it up to turn it into a multi-unit rental, a final irony that I'm sure stings every time they drive past that neighborhood. For the first time in nearly 30 years, my mother has a manager. She is working 24 hours a week as a receptionist at a mid-sized dental clinic, a job that requires her to be polite to people she used to consider beneath her. Sarah had to drop out of her graduate program when the tuition funds vanished, and she's currently waitressing at a chain restaurant 2 towns over, where her social status is measured in tips rather than likes. They have become social pariahs in our small hometown. In a community where everyone knows everyone's business, the story of a brother who sold his sibling's dog and forged his name for gambling money spreads like wildfire. The saintly mother act didn't survive the discovery of the legal documents proving she had been a willing participant in the financial drain. People who used to invite them to galas and country club lunches now look the other way in the grocery store. They are living in a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment with thin walls and a view of a parking lot, surviving on the meager wages of the entry-level world they had mocked for so long. I blocked their numbers months ago, but on Christmas Eve, a restricted call bypassed my filter. I made the mistake of answering, thinking it was a delivery driver. It was my mother. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual haughty vibrato, replaced by a wet, desperate wheeze. She told me that they were sitting in the dark because they couldn't afford the heating bill and the holiday together. She went into a graphic, heart-wrenching description of their dinner, claiming they were eating canned soup and stale bread while I sat in my mansion surrounded by wealth I wouldn't share. She tried one last time to use the old tools, guilt, shame, and the sacred bond of blood. She asked me how I could sleep knowing my own flesh and blood was starving during the holidays. I looked over at Cooper, who was curled up on a custom orthopedic bed by the fireplace, his coat glowing in the warmth of the hearth. I thought about the shiver in his legs when I found him at the Breeder's Gate. I thought about the $412,000 that would never truly be repaid, and the 10 years of my life I spent as a ghost so they could live as royalty. I didn't feel a flicker of the old FOG, fear, obligation, or guilt. I felt nothing but a clean, sterile sense of completion. I told her that I had heard her plea and that, in the spirit of the season, I would be making a significant financial contribution to mark the occasion. I watched the hope flare up in her voice for a split second before I finished the sentence. My mother called me, crying that they were eating canned soup for Christmas. I told her I'd send a donation to the local animal shelter in her name. I packed the remainder of my life into a single moving truck and left that city without a backward glance. I didn't need the closure of a final argument or the hollow satisfaction of watching them pack their bags. The silence of their absence was the only trophy I required. I moved 3 states away to a coastal town where nobody knows my name or the history of my bank account. I bought a house with a wraparound porch and a massive, 3-acre yard that is bordered by ancient oak trees and a sturdy, high fence. It is a sanctuary designed for a single purpose, the absolute comfort of the one soul who never betrayed me. The $412,000 is gone, and I know I will likely never see more than a fraction of it through the court-ordered restitution payments that Marcus will ignore once he's released. But I have realized that the money wasn't a loss, it was a ransom payment for my own life. I call it the peace dividend. Every morning, I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee that I don't have to share and a schedule that isn't dictated by someone else's manufactured crisis. There are no frantic phone calls about car accidents, no hidden credit card bills, and no crushing weight of ungrateful expectations pressing down on my chest. Cooper spends his days chasing squirrels and napping in the sun-drenched patches of grass, his coat thick and shiny again, his eyes clear of the terror that once haunted them. He is safe, and so am I. I've learned that the most dangerous thing you can do to a person who has spent their life being the responsible one is to give them a reason to stop caring. My family made the mistake of thinking my kindness was a bottomless well, but even the deepest well runs dry if you poison the water. They touched my peace, and they touched my dog, and in doing so, they deleted their own access to the only person who was holding their world together. They thought I was the family mistake, a boring workhorse to be used and discarded. Turns out, I was the only thing keeping them from the edge. And I just stopped holding the rope.